Swinburne University of Technology.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for your attendance today. My name's Stephane Shepherd and welcome to the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science's ongoing seminar series for 2015. As you've noticed, we've got the camera set up. We are filming this seminar, so if we could all be sort of polite and well behaved, that would be fantastic. And the video will be available through Swinburne and uploaded to the CFBS website at some point in the future. So today we have organised an excellent panel who will be discussing an important and under-researched area, increasing cultural competence and Indigenous representation in psychology. So cultural competence is about implementing systematic mechanisms that enhance the effective cross-cultural communication, and this is of particular significance in the domain of psychology, where there is both an underrepresentation of Indigenous practitioners and frequent alarming reports of service underutilisation by many Indigenous people who continue to find psychological health services alienating and culturally inappropriate. So these are some of the notions that the panel will be addressing today. But before we begin proceedings, I'd like to invite Andrew Peters, Senior Lecturer in Indigenous Studies here at Swinburne University, to present an acknowledgement to country. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Stephane. Hi everybody and welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Some of you will be aware and some of you may not of the importance of acknowledgements and welcomes to country. We're living in a society today that is slowly making some progress towards a better understanding of our own cultures and our own identities. As Steph mentioned, I'm a lecturer in Indigenous Studies at the undergrad level at Swinburne, and one of the key messages I like to get across to my students is the importance of learning about Aboriginal culture, not for Aboriginal people, but for yourselves. This is a history and a culture that belongs to the very land that we all live on today. According to Aboriginal law, if you were born on someone's land or born on a particular area of land, you automatically have some rights and responsibilities to that land. You're responsible to the people, you're responsible to uphold the culture, and you have a responsibility to look after the land so that the land will look after you. And no matter where you were born, that's an inherent part of that culture and land connection. There's no reason why we, as Australians, and everybody, can't embrace that kind of ideology today. If you were born in Australia, you were born on Aboriginal land, so you can be part of that history as well. We don't need to look at it as a racially divided sort of culture and history. It belongs to all of us, it should belong to all of us. And my message to my students is if they can embrace that, they'll start to feel proud of that culture and that history. I'm also a lecturer in tourism, and I've been to a number of tourism seminars and conferences where we often talk about how to make Australia look unique and attractive to international visitors. We have the oldest living culture on the planet living here. For at least 80,000 years of culture of survival, of adapting to the changing environments around it, yet we don't show enough outward pride, in my view, of that as a nation. Because as I say, it does belong to all of us. It's not just an Indigenous thing. I'm lucky that I get to live and work on the country of my ancestors. I'm a Wurundjeri man, also a Yorta Yorta background from my grandfather and grandmother's sides. I have a white father who I only met about 10 years ago, and he's Irish, which is clearly where I get my temper from. So my mum keeps telling me. My mum, Auntie Dot, is an elder. She's very esteemed. I remember when I was younger, I learned that mum knew how to make baskets out of grass, what's called basket coiling. And I was staggered because my whole life up until that point, which granted hadn't been long, only 10 years, mum had never shown me that she had this knowledge. And the more I pressed her about it and the more I asked questions, the more she told me a lot of the stuff she learned from her grandmother. One of the things that I didn't realise until I got a bit older too, is that I'm only two and three generations removed from ancestors who lived off the land, who survived by living in the bush, who knew the rules, who learned from elders, who spoke language, who knew and felt that connection to country. And I made a decision, a conscious decision, that I wasn't going to let the colonial world that had taken over Australia to consume my belief and my connection to my people and my culture. I've had people when I do some talks kind of have slightly disappointed faces when they look at me, because I'm not standing here with makeup on in a lap, standing on one leg, holding a spear with a kangaroo jumping around me. Because that's the image that we've created about Aboriginal people. You're about to hear from three wonderful people about how that stereotype is so very, very wrong. that Aboriginality exists today all around us. The trees that we can see out of the windows here, granted, you know, we've got trains going past and roads and all those sorts of things, but you look under that, the very land that we're standing on, that this building is on, is Wurundjeri country. Ancestors walked across this land, hunting, fishing, surviving, playing, talking. They would often come together in places such as this to talk about ideas, to talk with people from other cultures, from other tribes and clans, to share their ideas. Exactly what you guys are doing today. In terms of welcomes to country, as some of you again may be aware, traditionally they're done by elders. In today's world, it's a very important part of maintaining our connection with that 80,000 year history that I mentioned before. When people come together from different parts, pre-contact times, which I call instead of traditional, pre-contact times, they would need to be welcomed onto someone else's land before any business could be conducted. That's in law, listening to the spirits, listening to the ancestors, listening to the rules of country and society. So today, we emulate that tradition and that practice by welcoming people from different areas to one area to congregate, to share ideas, to share knowledge, to embrace culture and to embrace each other. Welcomes are traditionally done by an elder of the local people. In traditional times, they would take days. Unfortunately, in our modern-paced world, and I'm reminded by this by the clock on the wall telling me how long to talk for, we don't have that luxury, unfortunately. In some areas, we do, where we see dancers, particularly young children dancing, and the dance is the welcome from the spirits, welcoming you to the land that you're on. I'm not considered an elder, despite my rapidly greying hair brought on by my two small children, who refuse to let me sleep most nights. I'm not considered an elder. I'm certainly not wise enough to consider myself an elder. But it's my great privilege, with permission from Wurundjeri elders, that I am able to acknowledge that we are on Wurundjeri country and to welcome you people to this Wurundjeri country. Welcoming you is a way that, if you weren't born on this country, you go through the welcome ceremony, you then become kind of like a tenant. You have rights and responsibilities. They're a bit limited because it's not your birthright to be on this country, but you still do have rights and responsibilities to that land. So by sitting through an acknowledgement or a welcome in this situation, you are being welcomed to the country. The spirits, Bunjil the eagle, Wah the raven, who I hear often at my work at the Hawthorn campus and fly around this area. They're the embodiment of our protectors. They are the ones that tell us, yes, it's okay, you are doing a good job, you are doing the right thing. So when I have permission from my elders, it means that you are all welcome to this country too. Bunjil and Wah welcome you all. That the business you're about to conduct over the next couple of hours has been blessed by our spirits and is powered by 80,000 years of culture and history in this very land that we're on today, this very spot that we're on. I often tell students too, when we talk about Melbourne and connecting the city of Melbourne as we see it today with that traditional culture, the MCG is probably considered an icon of Melbourne. It's a symbol of who we are as a society. The MCG sits in Yarra Park. Yarra Park was the spot where the Kulin Nation, the 5 groups of the Kulin Nation, Werwarang, Bunurong, Wattarong, Jajarong and Tumbarong, would meet and congregate just north of the Yarra River to share ideas, to come together, to celebrate. And for at least 150 years, once a year, particularly on Grand Final Day, we have 100,000 people coming from all different lands on that same spot to welcome each other, to celebrate, to congregate, to share. We are practicing Indigenous culture every day. A lot of you would have done Indigenous things already today without even realising it. So it's a great thing for us to embrace our own connection to Aboriginal culture. And having an acknowledgement like this at events like this is a way for you all to find that connection for yourselves. So again, with permission from the elders, I would like to say Wurundjeri Balwa Minji Kayimin Kundibik, which means the Wurundjeri people welcome you to the land today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for your words, much appreciated. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we hold this seminar today, and I pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and I also extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present here today. So today we are lucky enough to have three astute panellists. In the middle, Dr. Sabine Hammond. Sabine Hammond is the Executive Manager, Science and Education and Membership at the APS, the Australian Psychological Society. Sabine is an honorary professor and former head of school in psychology at the Australian Catholic University and a fellow of the APS. As part of her work on competencies of psychologists, Sabine is involved in the international project on competence in psychology. Now, to your left is Heather Gridley. Heather is the APS Manager of Public Interest. Heather was a founding member of the APS Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples and Psychology Interest Group and was the manager responsible for overseeing the development and implementation of the APS Reconciliation Action Plan. Heather is a community and counselling psychologist who has published and presented widely. Heather is an honorary fellow in the College of Arts at Victoria University. To your right, Dr. Gregory Phillips. Dr. Phillips is a senior Indigenous consultant for the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project. He's an academic and consultant. Dr. Phillips was project manager of the Council of Deans of Australian Medical Schools Indigenous Curriculum Project and was recently awarded a PhD for his study entitled Dancing with Power, Aboriginal Health, Cultural Safety and Medical Education. Greg is a respected facilitator and leader in the field of Indigenous health and brings a rich background of experience and expertise. So could we all welcome our panel today? Thank you.
Thanks, Stephane. Okay, I'd just like to echo that acknowledgement and thank you for that welcome. I used to walk my dog around this area, and I know that we're very close to the Merri Creek, and we're very close to where the Merri Creek meets up with the Yarra, and so in my imagination the Wurundjeri people would have been very present in this area, and so hopefully we can do them justice by what we're talking about today. My job at APS, as Stephane said, is Manager of Public Interest, which I also sometimes call the Minister for Political Correctness, because whatever the APS does or says that has to do with what's in the public interest, so it might be around reconciliation or around refugee issues or domestic violence or any number of other things, climate change, disaster response, that's what my team does. So it's been my privilege over the last few years to be overseeing the Reconciliation Action Plan, but it really is a psychology-wide project and really much bigger than psychology because, as you probably know, the idea of reconciliation action plans is not something we dreamed up. And the co-chairs of the initiative, particularly of the working group that oversaw this, were Pat Dudgeon, who is possibly the most senior Aboriginal psychologist in the country. Many of you will have heard of her. And she was one of the founders and now vice chair of the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, known as AIPA, and also Tim Hannon, who was the president of the APS during the 2 of the 3 years of the plan. So that, I guess, symbolises some of the partnership aspect. It's actually 20 years ago now, since in 1995. Some of us were old enough to have been there, when Rob Riley gave the first Indigenous keynote address at an APS conference, and that was in Perth. And he put out this challenge to psychology about how many of you have an understanding of Aboriginal culture and history and contemporary issues. For many of you, this work is crucial given the social conditions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients in your work environment in such places as prisons and the welfare sector and communities where there are large numbers of Aboriginal clients. It's your responsibility to seek that knowledge and understanding now and to ensure that it's available for future generations of psychologists in psychological training and education programs. It's a very powerful challenge, and I couldn't say at all that we've in any way come near to meeting it. It's really great that you're here today because we're talking about forensic psychology in particular, which, as you know, there's an over-representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the justice system, often as both victims and perpetrators in some cases in the court system. So it's fantastic. And I just wanted to check, and just for a show of hands, how many of you are students at the moment studying psychology, studying forensic psychology or forensic science? Great. How many of you are practitioners already working out in the field? Testing the fire alarm, great. And how many of you are teaching psychology or teaching forensic psychology in some context? Hello, Anne. Okay, have I missed any categories there?
Yep.
Yep. What are you?
A non-psychologist.
I should have asked that. I beg your pardon. See, so non-psychologists, that's you. Hooray. Any other non-psychologists? Well, Greg, yes. Yeah, so thank you for coming on. That just helps us to know kind of where to pitch it to. I hope there isn't really a fire. And if one of these days I'm going to get a fire alarm, there really is a fire. And, actually did happen to me once. Okay, so reconciliation, this is the definition that comes from Reconciliation Australia, is a two-way process. So it's not just about us doing the feel-good thing for Aboriginal people, as Andrew said. It's also it's something that we benefit from, all of us. So building respect and relationships can benefit all Australians, help us in a psychology context to make it a more inclusive profession and discipline. It's everybody's business. At the APS, it's not just my team's business, it's Sabine's team business, and it's seen as a whole of, it's about the National Office, it's about members, it's about students, and it's great to see a university picking this up. They've been, University of New England, I went up there a couple of years ago and talked to their staff up there in Armidale, and they were also seeing it as something that was very important to them, because they also said, we have more Aboriginal people outside the court than we have studying here, and we'd like to turn that round. So that was one of their motivations. So turning good intentions into real actions, it's a great line, I think. So so for psychology, I'll just flip through this because it probably should be pretty obvious. We think psychologists are our key professional group that if we think our work is important, then it's important to be inclusive. It's going to be important to all Australians, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Somebody said once along the way of this journey, and I thought it was a very telling statement, that if we do something really good, like if you come up with a great intervention or a theory or whatever, and only some people benefit from it, then you're actually widening the gap. And that hadn't occurred to me before, that you could do a great thing and you've widened the gap because you haven't applied it or checked out whether it's culturally appropriate. You've managed not to include, say, Aboriginal people in your study in the first place, or worked out whether this particular test applies and whatever. And so suddenly you've actually done something that only benefits part of the population. So the more we think our work is worth doing, the more we ought to be thinking about how inclusive is it. We wanted to formalise the APS commitment, build on what APS was hopefully already doing, try and close the gap, and also in that give positive sense learning from the resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals and communities that have survived, right through from pre-contact times. And in fact, it's interesting that the Aboriginal population is actually growing when people thought it was going to die out. So that's probably the strongest sign of resilience you can get. So the vision of the APS was a commitment to building respect, relationships and understanding between Indigenous and other Australians to close the gap in mental health and wellbeing outcomes. That's just a fairly simple, clear statement, I hope. We had a working group, and it occurred to me when you look at that photo that you can't always pick who the Aboriginal people are there, because they're not always black. I sometimes say, gee, don't remember if I ever taught many Aboriginal students at Victoria University, and I do know of a couple. Then I thought, but how would I know? Because we kind of assume that we have a stereotype, like with the spear or whatever, or coming from Darwin or somewhere. But actually, particularly in Victoria, you don't know whether your client or your student or whoever it is, and it's really important to take that into account. So that was our working group who worked with us, and eventually we consulted and got endorsement from the APS Board and Reconciliation Australia. And this was the plan we came up with, and this is the kind of bones of it, really. Those kind of four key planks, I suppose, and I'll say a little bit more about each of them in a moment, but if you can keep that diagram in mind, we thought these were the most important things that psychology should be looking at. Building respect for relationships. If psychologists don't know about relationships, then gosh, we're in trouble. So building relationship with key groups, looking at partnerships, looking to learn about cultural protocols. Governance sounds boring, but actually if you haven't got support from the top of your organisation, you're not going to get anywhere. And if that isn't really integrated in a way that it isn't just the most powerful people getting to say what happens, but actually the people most affected. So also the government needs to actually involve the people the plan is most directed at. Cultural competence seems to speak for itself. We thought of that both looking at our training and also professional development, what we do in practice, and education and employment focused on building a workforce of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychologists, both with students and then supporting those once they graduate. So that's the overall, and then down we also had the importance of having strong partnerships to build our accountability, and the main partners in the plan was the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association and Reconciliation Australia itself. So that's that diagram. Very quickly, respectful relationships have to form the basis of everything we do, and you can't get anywhere if you don't really focus on that. Thinking about what it means, the centrality of relationships within psychology, and we were thinking at this stage both inward to our national office but also outward to our member groups and our members, and then to the wider community and what's the relationship. And we thought we've actually got, and we possibly don't have time to do it really, but later on we will. In one of the tools we developed, which came from Reconciliation Australia, was a reflection tool that just invites people to think about things like, do you know who the, on whose land you stand at the moment, wherever you are, where you live, where you were born. There was a map went around the APS office last week, and we thought it was a good one to circulate for Reconciliation Week, which is next week, as many of you probably know. And this map had a picture of all of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander groups all around Australia, and there's hundreds of them, as you probably know if you've seen one of those maps. And people could click on it and say, this is where I was born, this is who the traditional owners of that area are. They might not have known that before. And people in the staff were going, oh, I didn't know that, and clicking on it, and suddenly and that was just a little bit more awareness, possibly at a superficial level, but it links into that notion of whose country am I on, what's my responsibility in that. Do you know who the local Aboriginal health services are in your area? And you know the difference in Victoria in particular, we call them community-controlled organisations, Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. I think in Northern Territory and some other states they call it Aboriginal Medical Services, the AMS, but basically they form very similar functions. They're probably the key organisations, but they might be Aboriginal legal services or other services that, or simply councils of elders or land councils. How do we know in our own areas where those key bodies are, and what we would do if we needed to find out? If you needed to organise a welcome to country, where would you go? And if they've never heard of you before, why would they bother taking you seriously? So if you haven't built those relationships up along the way, then to suddenly go when it suits you sounds a bit hollow. So we've learned a lot about this, and we have developed some cultural protocols for APS member groups and that, and they're on our website, and I think they're pretty good. They look a bit scary when you first see them because there's quite a lot around seeking permissions and not taking the first answer and not assuming that the government department that tells you the answer has the right answer and all those sorts of things. But people, for instance, our conference people are now getting much better at kind of going, oh, I know how to ask that question now, and I know how to validate, and I know who to check with, and all that sort of thing, and it gets easier. Doing reconciliation locally, looking at what groups can do wherever they are to build those relationships locally. Celebrating public events like Reconciliation Week next week, and also some of the protocols around acknowledgement of country and particularly at public events like conferences and such. Interestingly, of course, if you've got a group like the APS Institute, which runs training all around the country, which group do they acknowledge? And they actually have a slide for their webinars now which actually acknowledges whatever group the people participating in the webinar are on, gives them an opportunity to reflect, but it doesn't name them. Governance, we've tried to look at our structures to see how they can be more mutually respectful and empowering, and trying to look at, I've skipped over what we've done with that because I don't want to kind of take up too much time. Cultural competence, Sabine is going to talk a bit more about that, but this is just the commitment to try and look at psychologists being more culturally competent and facilitate training for members and giving access to resources and such, and looking at things like assessment tools. We have managed to get started on the project Sabine is going to talk about. The Indigenous psychologists have been delivering cultural competence training all around the country. I'm not sure if they've still got funding for that. We're revising the APS ethical guidelines. Most of you would be familiar with those. Amongst the first of the specific ethical guidelines developed around 20 years ago were the ones for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but they are in the process of being massively updated now together with AEPA, and looking at our own cultural education and competence. And the flip side of that is increasing the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychologists supporting students, looking at employment strategies. How many people do you employ in your own workplace? You know, have you thought about, rather than getting, bringing people in as guests, actually employing them in an ongoing way? Universities have to think about that all the time, and within the organisation. And I'm not going to go through those key achievements because I think Sabine is going to talk about that. And this is the logo for the Indigenous Psychology Project, which is the one that is underway at the moment. And the Bendy Lango is the notice for the scholarship that we put out every year. And I just wanted to slip this in because a couple of weeks ago, a month ago I think, I presented some of this at the Forensic Psychology Conference that was up in Sydney. Was anybody there? Okay, good, I can say it again then. And we just were talking more broadly about social determinants of health and access to justice from a social determinants perspective. And we think of the social determinants of health as being the circumstances in which people are born and grow up with, and that are shaped by a wider set of forces of economics and politics and so forth. And when Aboriginal people talk about social and emotional wellbeing, it's a concept that really gets this notion that our health and our wellbeing are very socially determined. And it's something with our very medical models in psychology and medicine we often lose sight of. I think that's really important. And in forensic context, things to like access to justice, the working with vulnerable and disadvantaged populations. I'm sure that you all know what I mean when I'm talking about this, and that if we try and think about a social determinants approach, we need to not think about how we're not using our expertise. We like to see ourselves as, the experts, the expert witnesses in court, or the expert assessors or so. But what if we're using our expertise in a way that disadvantages somebody who is more vulnerable? Those are the things we need to keep in mind. So, what can you do? We have a reflection tool to help you begin your journey. You can talk about implementing some of these protocols at your organisation's level. Think about how you can support or mentor Indigenous psychology students. Build relationships with your local community. Attend, facilitate, support cultural competence training. Think about an employment strategy in your own workplace, and recognise and celebrate significant dates. This is the self-reflection questions, which I probably won't go through now, but we might come back to them towards the end, because I probably talked enough. If you want to know more about what the APS is doing, that's just an overview. There's a couple of web addresses, and they are actually on the back of the book that I just handed around, so that should help you. And I think that's me. I'm just going to hand over to Sabine now, and if I can look at her, get rid of my presentation. And I don't know if anybody's got any questions from that, or if we hold it over until we've proceeded.
If anyone has any questions now, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we can have Q&A at the end. Okay.
Well, I don't know, but anyways, there we go. Well, welcome everybody, and I think again, in the spirit of our seminar today, I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land where we're meeting today, and their elders past and present. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and I'll talk a little bit more about how do we actually try to make sure that as psychologists or any other professionals working in this space, where would you like for me to stand? What are you trying to get?
Fine.
Okay, cool. So that we actually do the right thing. And I think as I've been doing this project with the APS and with my Indigenous colleagues, I've been on a steep learning curve. And I think that's one of the things I think is important for me to get across to you, that even if you're a pretty darn experienced psychologist, and if I tell you that I saw my first client in 1981, does that make me reasonably experienced? It's been a long time. Many of you weren't even born by that time yet. I still learn a lot, and this has been an incredibly important project for me because it's also enhanced my own learning and understanding. And I think if you take anything away from this today, then it's that real importance of remaining open to learning about, I think, yeah, the original owners of this country. And I'm not Australian, I probably should say. But I think that's why it's even more important for me as somebody who's come here to learn about it. Because, you know, when I first came to Australia, I was in Armidale, New South Wales. So I went to the public library and I got out all the books that had a little kangaroo on the back. Because they were by Australian authors. What do you think I learned? Anybody want to give a wild guess? What did I glean from these books? Captain Cook. Let's forget about Captain Cook. What else? Yeah, it didn't pop up that much. There was a pretty strong theme in all of those books, which I didn't know. Anybody want to give a guess? Not our bad. Anybody in here? They're too scared. Okay, I'll tell you. It is all about Gallipoli. I learned about how Australians have been really traumatized by Gallipoli. And that's what I learned by reading my kangaroo books. But it was very little about Aboriginal culture. Or I think the one book of little crime stories about this half caste. That's not the right language, but that was how the book was written back then. It's a 50s book called Boney. No, that one?
Yeah, I've heard.
Yeah. My hunch is that it probably contains every single cliche you could possibly imagine. And again, that was my introduction to Australia and Aboriginal culture. It wasn't a very good one, and I think that's why this project is so important. Let me just ask you, how much any of you who are students, how many of you know an Aboriginal student in your class or had one in the past? Anybody who's been in a class with an Aboriginal student, you're definitely sure. Okay.
I'm social work though.
Okay, that's okay. Irrespective of profession. So in this entire group we have 2 people. And isn't there something about Aboriginal people not giving eye contact? I'm looking at Andrew, he's not looking away. I'm looking at Greg, he's not looking away. So am I allowed to make eye contact with Aboriginal people? Have I just committed some major social faux pas by making eye contact with these 2 wonderful gentlemen? Anybody can help me with this? Who feels like me, they're really not quite sure? Yeah, okay. Anybody who's dead sure if I've done something wrong? It's a scary topic, isn't it? Because we don't quite know. And so we're not quite sure, who should we ask? Should we ask Greg? Should we ask Andrew? Is that even appropriate to ask? Are we going to step on their toes if we ask them? And I think that's some of the themes that have come out as we actually started to engage with our Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project. Lots of us who are of the non-Aboriginal background are really scared to ask some of these questions, and a lot of times we don't know. And so even though we may have good intentions, there's also the risk for us that we do something we probably shouldn't be doing just because we don't know. So I don't know if I have all the answers for you, but I'll try to tell you how we're trying to figure some out. In the intention with our project, APEP project, is to really see how we can support ultimately Indigenous social emotional health. And obviously that's not going to only help Aboriginal people if we acknowledge especially the Indigenous approach to health, which really focuses on mind-body interaction and the connection between physical and psychological health within the social context, which plays a much bigger role within the Aboriginal community. That actually has implications for all Australian people, everybody in the country. So, it's not, I think, thinking from a wide perspective, what can we do to Aboriginal Australians? So somebody really get into trouble the other day because they did research on Aboriginal Australians. And what's wrong with the word on? Don't we all do research on? Any of you do research on autism? No, you're forensic psychs. Research on juvenile delinquents? Anybody here? No. But research on? What's wrong with research on? Nothing? What's wrong?
It implies you're doing it too rather than with.
Exactly. And I think it's subtle things like that, that we need to be very mindful of. So when we're talking about Indigenous social and emotional health, it's not that we as white Australians suddenly do something to Aboriginal Australians. I think that's the wrong approach. It's really saying let's have this an interactive process and mutual learning. I think that's what this slide says. On the other hand, what we also know, and this is, I think, increasingly written up as saying that we need to acknowledge that Australia has had a colonial history. This is where you get into the hot politics, and some people would disagree on that. But what Indigenous Australians have experienced is dispossession and oppression. A very large number of them have done it really, really hard. And what that's resulted in is when we talk about the gap. A huge gap between where Aboriginal Australians ought to be and where they currently are. And that's not true for everybody. We've got two gentlemen here who obviously have succeeded. We don't know against which odds, but it looks like these two, Dr. Greg and Andrew, I know your doctor as well.
Almost doctor.
Almost Dr. Andrew. So maybe they've managed to close the gap, but we don't know what hurdles they have to actually get there. But many Aboriginal Australians do experience this huge gap. And because of that, the consequences for them are incredible. Not only psychological disorders, but for the forensic psychs here, obviously incarceration, poor physical health, but also intergenerational issues of grief, violence, poverty, and where what we have officially Australia portraying itself as a first world country with people living in third world circumstances. And that is problematic. And I think want to close that gap. So there are a number of ways we can try to close these gaps. We're looking at, from our project, both at education and at policy, and obviously we can look at service providers. We're not going to talk about that today. So what's happening in education? And I think I need to speed up a little bit. We have lots of curricula. Greg has been involved in the medicine curriculum. We have public health frameworks, medical colleges beginning frameworks, Health Workforce Australia, when they still existed, we're looking at interprofessional frameworks. It doesn't really matter how you get the knowledge. It's important that you get the knowledge, I think is my message here. But a curriculum only goes so far. In order to affect real changes, we need to make sure that there's some oomph to actually making sure that higher education providers include proper information in their curricula. How do we do that? Through accreditation. Now for psychology, that's actually APAC, and I'll have a slide a little bit later on where we talk about what we're trying to do with APAC. Thirdly, we need to really look at how do we get Indigenous students into universities and keep them there. And that is really, really hard. And part of it is hard because, not necessarily because of capability, intellectual, academic, but sometimes in terms of feeling safe. And you've probably not thought about this because most of you are of reasonably light skin colors. But I mean, imagine you actually went into a setting where you're suddenly the only one who's just white. Have you thought about if that would make you feel different? Or, would you worry a little bit? For some Indigenous Australians, that's what they might feel like every single day. As I said, others we won't be able to recognize. But it's that safety kind of thing. And you have the history of disadvantage, of stolen generation, where I think many Aboriginal people have good reason to not feel safe right away. And there's, I think, an onus on us when we're in the university setting to actually help people feel safe. And that's going into very basic psychological concepts. Very hard to operationalize and measure them, and usually don't talk about feeling safe in universities. First time anybody talks about feeling safe in a university? Maybe it's funny, but I think that's the themes I hear from talking to Aboriginal students. And that's a key issue if we want to keep them in a university. Get them in and then keep them there. We also need Indigenous professional bodies to help us lobby. And for psychology, we have the Australian Indigenous Psychology Association. And we've listed all kind of other ones. And Universities Australia, the peak, I think was a body representing all Australian universities, has guidelines for culturally safe universities. So I think the point is, it's not just a one simple approach. We really need a multi-pronged approach and work from all different kinds of areas. I probably won't go into much detail on this slide, but basically, we're working on this from the Commonwealth's perspective, both from the state and territories have different approaches to this, and again, cross-jurisdictional with COAG. We had Health Workforce Australia. We now have this, the Australian Health Practitioner Registration Agency, or APRA. We have ATSI Health Worker registration. We have Closing the Gap. Lots of national things that are happening at the policy level. And there are also things happening on the service provider level, on the Commonwealth's policies for education, for workforce, and hopefully getting to cultural safety in healthcare provision. We're still not quite there yet. On the states level, hospital accreditation, for example, for cultural safety projects. See how that safety theme keeps coming up over and over? And again, cross-jurisdictional and national cultural respect framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. There's more things happening, and probably more things could be happening, and if we had more time, we could get into them. What's happening in psychology? We had the curriculum framework guidelines by Ranjit McConaughey from South Australia. That was in 2006. Not much happened since, definitely didn't get implemented nationally. The Psychology Board of Australia has as one of its competencies knowledge of the discipline, and we have one whopping dot point on intercultural and Indigenous psychology, and Competence 7. And these are the competences you need if you want to work as a registered psychologist. Demonstrated awareness of one's own cultural background and any resulting bias or skewed perception of client experience. So again, as a non-Australian, am I blaming Aboriginal Australians for their experience, because I don't understand from my perspective what their perspective is. Demonstrated ability to acquire relevant knowledge of the client's cultural background. And sometimes universities don't make that very easy because they don't really integrate that information in the curriculum. And finally, it's demonstrated skills and special abilities required to assess and intervene with culturally different clients in an effective and culturally relevant manner. That's the hardest, folks. That is really difficult. And we would be spending another, I think, several months to cover all of that. So, but at least that's what's happening in psychology. APAC standards currently are not very detailed. The APS, together with the APEC project and our, I think, RAP and IEPA and our Indigenous interest groups have made submissions to APAC. That's the Australian Psychology Accreditation Council, our accrediting body, and they are revising some of their standards now, so that hopefully things will be making it much clearer, and that will give the oomph basically and the incentive to universities to integrate that content into your coursework so you can actually learn about it. There's some of the ones that are listed. So we do need to do more in terms of working on all levels so that we actually can get content into your curriculum. What are some of the barriers to doing this? And this is after interviewing both lecturers, heads of schools or departments, that's the HOD. We also interviewed Indigenous support centers, and typically one of the things we hear is that, why is it relevant? How many Aboriginal people do we have here in Melbourne? What's the likelihood you'll work with one? Isn't it much more likely that you'll work with somebody who's Vietnamese? Yeah, I'd be pretty close to Victoria Street here. Aren't you more likely to work with somebody who's of Chinese background or Greek or Italian? So why is it relevant to know about Indigenous Australians? We hear that a lot. And the other thing we hear a lot is that, but the curriculum is so full, there's so much we need to teach you, why should we make space for teaching you that? One thing. Second thing is, I don't know how to integrate it, and that's what we hear from lecturers. And if I integrate it, how do I do it? How do I make sure that I'm not going to be culturally inappropriate? And you see Greg taking lots of notes because he's taking note of every time I say something wrong, he can tell you what I'm doing. The other key thing is, to make this more relevant for everybody, we need more Indigenous people in universities. That's both at the lecture and at the student level. And there are too few. And then it becomes a real burden, because then everybody makes them their expert. And that can feel really overwhelming if you're suddenly the only one that everybody goes to. And there's still only 24 hours in the day. And in addition, we need to make sure that we avoid paternalism or racism. Again, sometimes good intentions are there, but it's easy to, put your foot in. And even at my experience, I still do it occasionally, and I just hope that my colleagues forgive me, but they usually tell me off, luckily. What do Indigenous graduates tell us? A lot of their training is actually not that relevant for the communities they want to work with. They really struggle with how visible or invisible they want to be in the classroom. And my hunch is, I saw very few hands going up saying, do you know of an Indigenous student? You might have sat with somebody in the classroom for all these years and you never knew, because on some level they might have preferred not to identify, especially if they didn't look traditionally Indigenous, if their skin was clearer, they might have felt safer, and again, it might have avoided that burden of being identified all the time. Not enough critical mass, being the only one, not people don't understand cultural diversity, the whiteness of our society, and what they perceive as systematic oppression, racism. So what should an inclusive curriculum look like? Obviously, we need to include Indigenous people in the design, which we're doing with our APEP project. Have a foundation of Indigenous social and emotional well-being as a part of the curriculum, and then build on those skills starting in the first year undergraduate and going throughout all of your training. And that takes a lot of commitments from the universities, and from those of you who are students as well, and from the lecturers. Everybody needs to be focused on that. I think we've focused on strength-based models, linking with other disciplines so we actually share things, don't reinvent the wheel, and make sure that all of our resources are culturally sensitive, accurate, and appropriate. It's a heck of a lot of work, isn't it? Okay. Some barriers. I think I need to hurry up, don't I? Isolation, under-resourcing of projects, geographical distance, cultural isolation, stigma of tertiary study. Facilitators, any support systems we have. HECs, scholarships, outreach, mentoring, culturally sensitive promotional material. I think my experience with universities, if you have an Indigenous support center, makes a huge difference for the students, because that can be their safe place. What will move the agenda? I think I've already alluded to that. We need people, but we also need people from the society nation perspective. We need to focus on working with. I think I made that point earlier. We need to value differences. We need to obviously work with the higher education sector, and within the discipline of psychology. I think Heather was talking about how the APS is committed, keeping that commitment and really seeing it through all levels of our profession. And where could you start? I think Heather talked about some of those. I think I'll skip that slide. And if you want more information, this is our website, and you can join our mailing list. And I think I've gone over time, so thank you.
All right, I might just use the board. Greg Phillips, I'm from Mount Isa, Wanyi and Jaru. I acknowledge Wurundjeri. I'm going to tell you the difference between cultural competence and cultural safety. A lot of Cultural competence is about individual skills of the practitioner or the worker in a hospital or a clinic. You may have heard of the term cultural awareness. That's the most basic form of knowledge. That's learning about the other. So it's treating people as other and as separate too. Cultural competence is about learning skills to work with other cultural groupings. Cultural safety is more about the organisational ability to engage, or the institutional ability to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So the organisation, if you think about a hospital, for example, the hospital is not culturally safe just if you employ an Aboriginal health liaison officer. It's not culturally safe if you just have Aboriginal flags out the front, or you do a sausage sizzle at NAIDOC week, or you have an Aboriginal employment strategy. Those are all good things, but that doesn't make the whole institution culturally safe. If we looked at cultural competence in that hospital, even if you trained every single person in the hospital or the clinic perfectly, if that were possible, even if we trained everyone perfectly about the culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, that still doesn't guarantee that that organisation is culturally safe. And that's about power and money. That's about who makes decisions for Aboriginal health, who decides where resources go, who decides if the Aboriginal health liaison officers are allowed to go and visit a local community organisation or not. So it's all these sorts of issues. And so cultural safety is a much broader concept. I'm going to, just at the risk of seeming a bit teacher-like, use this diagram. In New Zealand, the term cultural safety comes from New Zealand, and it started with Maori nurses trying to reform Maori nursing curricula to be more appropriate for Maori people. And they defined cultural safety as a decolonising process of society and institutions, as individual competencies, cultural competencies, as cultural awareness of the other, as organisational processes and decision making and governance, a whole range of things. So they started out about 20 years ago talking about cultural safety and lobbying with nursing schools to get cultural safety into the curriculum, and they got it into the curriculum. And then about 10 years later, cultural safety was written into the national public health legislation, so that every health service provider in the country had to prove how they were being culturally safe and how they were being responsive to Maori peoples. But what happened over time, after about 15 years, is health systems started to say, hold on a minute, we've got all different other cultures here. We've got a large Pacific Islander community, we have a large Asian community, we have people from all different cultural backgrounds. We're doing cultural safety for everyone. Why are these Maoris still bloody whinging? Pretty much, right? So that's important to know, because Maori people then had to say, no, hold on a minute. Cultural safety was argued for from a Maori perspective, for all cultures, yes, and particularly for Maori people, but about all cultures. But that's not Maori health in its totality. So they're very similar, and I wanted to put this diagram up to explain that subtle difference between cultural safety and Aboriginal health. So in Australia, we don't have a treaty written into our national public health legislation, the Treaty of Waitangi. We don't have any understanding in national accreditation frameworks for hospital service provision or clinic service provision about how to be culturally safe as an organisation. What we do is we have a lot of stuff talking about equity and access and including Aboriginal people. And that's deficit model. Inadvertently, that's deficit. That means that Aboriginal people get treated simply as another cohort who are disadvantaged and underserved. As Paparangi Reid says, mad, bad and sad, pretty much, that all Aboriginal people are mad, bad and sad because of the statistics. And so we have to include them and raise them up to our good white level. And that's not, it's not meant like that, but that's actually how it works in the system. So it's really important to distinguish between what is being culturally safe and what is Aboriginal health. Aboriginal health is Aboriginal people leading the provision of services to and for Aboriginal people, if the whole system has taken responsibility to be culturally safe for all cultures. So it's a slightly different way of viewing these things. It's saying that Aboriginal health operates within an environmental or an ecological system, policies, society, cultures, who makes decisions about money. If that whole system has not thought about its privilege, its patterns of racism, inadvertent or overt, if it hasn't thought about their normalised way of doing epidemiology and the medical model of public health care, if it hasn't thought about decolonising all of that stuff, then they're not ready to do Aboriginal health. But if that system, what often happens is those systems say, oh, quick, there's an apology, we better jump in and do Aboriginal health. Quick, we better help close the gap. But they don't think about their own values, beliefs, ways of doing business as potentially problematic. And they jump in and do 4 or 2 Aboriginal people and jump straight to operational matters, such as how do we get more Aborigines in the door and keep them there and get them out the other side. As if the problem is the Aboriginal people's intellectual capacity, or their, those naughty Aborigines just won't turn up to their health clinic appointments, kind of thing. I mean, that's not how it's meant, but that's kind of the psychology of the planning and the thinking and the strategising for Aboriginal health. Instead of what we need the system to do is think about how does it be flexible? How does it change its processes so it can work with communities better? How does it make decisions about funding? How does it make decisions about who it employs? What selection criteria does it use for who it employs? They're the sorts of things that an organisation needs to do to be culturally safe. And Aboriginal health then is the provision of services by Aboriginal peoples to Aboriginal peoples. What usually happens, and I'm going to talk in crude terms here, if we say this is whitefellas, culturally safe, basically what happens is white people tell Aboriginal people what to do. How to think like whitefellas, get dressed, buy houses, get educated. Basically the whole system is set up to think of Aboriginal people as the problem and get them to be more like us, in crude terms. And on the other hand, Aboriginal people spend all our energy telling whitefellas what to do, how to have better policies, how to understand this better, what to do. And that's sort of all actually a bit of a waste of energy. What we need Aboriginal people to do is focus on delivering Aboriginal health services to our mob. And we need whitefellas on dealing with their racism. In crude terms. That's pretty much the answer. The problem is not your clients. The problem is you and your beliefs and systems and the way that you've been taught. So what we found in medicine is actually, it's not about teaching white medical students about Aboriginal culture. That is important, but what's more important is to teach them how to transformationally unlearn privilege, racism, the normalcy of their pedagogy and paradigms. So if psychology is serious about closing the gap, its job is to do cultural safety for all from an Aboriginal perspective and let Aboriginal people lead the delivery of Aboriginal health services in short terms. But often what happens in Australia is those two things get confused and we leave the Aboriginal Health Liaison Officer to not only deliver services to Aboriginal clients but to educate all of their non-Aboriginal colleagues about how to do things better. The parallel is in women's participation in society. I always use the example of the AFL because when the AFL 10 years ago, 5 years ago, decided they had a problem or woke up to the fact they might have had a bit of a problem with women in society and participation, they employed one woman whose job was to not only increase women's participation in AFL and sports and administration and on boards, but also to educate all of the blokes in the organisation about their sexism. Do you see how that's unfair? What we're doing is we're employing one Aboriginal person and expecting them to do that and that. And that's rubbish. We need the system, you guys, to do this stuff and Aboriginal people do that stuff. In supporting each other, obviously. I mean, there's some crossover there. Now, what all of those things rely on is you can't do Aboriginal health without acknowledging Aboriginal knowledge, local place. That's why Welcome to the Country is so important. I'm not from Melbourne. I can't do Aboriginal health here unless I'm working with and acknowledging local communities properly and using their knowledge about how to deliver services here. On the other hand, you can't be culturally safe for any other cultural group, be it Sudanese in Dandenong or Vietnamese in Richmond. You can't be culturally safe for those groups in Australia if you're not also acknowledging place, whose land it is, and how do those groups acknowledge local country. So it's a little bit of a clearer definition of what we're talking about and the task at hand. Thanks.
Are there any questions for the panel?
Just thoughts.
But don't be afraid of getting it wrong, guys. I mean, we're all on a learning journey, you know? We're all getting it.
Yes, I recently went to a rally in Melbourne against the closure of several rural Indigenous communities. And I was just wondering, in terms of the aims and objectives of your organisation, how hard is it and how frustrating to fight against our leadership and the negative connotations that they are placing on Aboriginal people?
It's a very good question, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, in a sense, we're a very small cog in a big wheel, and that's what Greg was talking about safety being systems wide, and you know, you could be a really competent practitioner in a really unsafe organisation or an unsafe society, which is what you're talking about. Decisions can get made. This is probably not an answer to your question, but just a comment. One of the dilemmas that I know I face at APS is getting an organisation like that to get political at all, in terms of making statements or whatever, and how do you get agreement that you should or whatever. But the other is it up to me to decide that I should, or how do I talk to my Aboriginal colleagues about whether this is their priority? That one is, to me, even though I know that it's a complex situation in those communities, and we're in Victoria and they're in Western Australia, but it's pretty hard to see how closing down communities is an answer to anything when we know of all about stolen generation, displacement and dispossession. It's not like we haven't learned those lessons, but obviously we haven't. Something that's more subtle and difficult is something like the Recognise campaign, where there's a big campaign out to recognise Aboriginal people in the Constitution. Now, what does a group like the APS, or what do individual psychologists do about that? How do we know that this is what Aboriginal people want? And I know there are divisions in Aboriginal communities around that question. But then do you say nothing until you've got that guidance? You know, so it can be a bit circular in terms, a bit like Greg was saying too, about, you know, who decides which area they're responsible for, and how do you work out that partnership of. I remember one of the Maori psychologists on our advisory group saying, well, you don't always need an Aboriginal person to tell you that shit stinks. It was exactly her term. She said, you don't have to ask us everything, for God's sake, you know. But on the other hand, you know, at what time should you consult, and at what time should you use your common sense, even though common sense is actually not very reliable because it's very culturally bound. Those are all sorts of questions that we wrestle with as individuals and organisation, but better to wrestle with them than ignore them, I guess, is the short answer. But yeah, I think it is really important to keep those big picture questions that you've asked in mind.
Oh, look, yeah, following on from that, I think it's really important to have established relationships with Aboriginal people that you work with, or organisations. Wherever you're working, be it an urban context or remote or rural, if you want to be a good clinician, even if you're not working specifically in Aboriginal health, make some time to make partnerships with your local service providers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or organisations. Because then when things do come up like that, you've got a reference point to say, hey, how do I do this? Aboriginal people don't expect you to know everything. I don't know everything, I'm still learning. It's impossible, you know, there's 230 different language groups, so it's impossible for me to know everything about every Aboriginal culture and person. But if you've got that relationship there, then you can go and ask the question and say, what about this? How do you think I could go here? So that's the first thing. On the question of politics, I think the big thing, the overarching psychological issue confronting Australia is our national identity. Who are we? We still don't want to acknowledge genocide in Australia, really. I mean, we've apologised, and Paul Keating's made his speeches, which are great, but at the same time we conduct a military intervention that's apparently going to deal with sexual abuse. So we are giving with one hand and taking away from the other. So it's a deep question for Australia to think about its shame about colonisation. I think there's deep psychological issues about the shame of being ancestors of convicts. I think we still have we haven't had that discussion nationally about who we are, how do we welcome and allow refugees and new Australians to have their own culture instead of beating it out of them in the schoolyard for speaking their own language. Those sorts of things we haven't really discussed as a nation, and so I think that's the role of psychology, is to help Australians have that conversation. It shouldn't be my role or Andrew's role, it shouldn't be the Aboriginal people's role all the time to have the conversations about these things. If there's one thing you can do to help close the gap, is have those conversations with your mob, with your families, your colleagues, your workplaces, your sporting groups. That can be a bit scary because you might not feel like you've got all the knowledge and language, but there's lots of stuff on the internet, some more reputable sources than others, but follow the psychology links, IATSIS in Canberra, and you need to skill yourself up about some of these basic issues and how to talk to others about them. You don't have to know all the answers. I'm not asking you to teach culture, I'm asking you to teach cultural safety, or to learn cultural safety, and to teach that with your friends and colleagues. Have the conversation with your family about colonisation, racism, new Australians. They're not easy conversations, but that shouldn't be left up to just Aboriginal people to have. That's issues that affect all of us.
And I think, it's interesting you were talking about Maori, because I know more Maori words than I know Aboriginal words.
Yeah.
Because, New Zealanders, Pakeha and such they're not perfect, but it's bread and butter to have to be educated in this stuff from very early on, and we haven't even got there yet, which is for me, I just kind of think that psychology is what I know, so that's going to have to be the territory where I do what I can. You have to find your space, your sphere of influence, I think, whether it's student politics or the rallies and behind them, or saying, well, what's my role within psychology to make this discipline and profession a bit more safe, and I guess that's hoping we're trying to do, but I still think we're running blind sometimes, and I worry that it's going to take a long time to get anything right.
We are getting there. It does start with your own self-knowledge about your own culture and values and how that helps you see the world in a particular way. If you understand that, you're more likely to be open to others. Yeah.
Somebody at the back there?
I guess just some advice I'm just seeking, actually, because I work in the prison health space as an Aboriginal project officer, and one of the things I guess part of my so one of the things I come up against, just conversations, whether it be informal or formal conversations, is the health is the same for everyone. That's what I come up against with the prison health setting. And so I guess in terms of influencing change, we talked about that type of safety. When we're doing things to create, change that thinking. But if I'm sitting in a meeting with, say, health service managers or general managers of prisons, what's your advice? How do I, just get to the point, like, it's not all the same. So what advice can you give, or what? It's not a simple answer, but actually it's a simple answer for me. But for the non-Aboriginal health workforce, it's kind of like we treat everyone the same.
Yeah. I mean, there is a very simple slide that I haven't got with which, but basically, if you treat everybody the same, you'll get unequal outcomes. So if you treat men and women the same, right? Women are allowed to have 9 months off to have a kid, then you'll get unequal outcomes. So it's that same concept, but educating,
Is that the model, though, that's been taught in terms of nursing and health? Is that what they're teaching in the same, everyone's the same, or is that changing now?
They're getting better at changing that, to understand that different populations and groups have different needs. Duh. Yeah, but it has taken a while. Yeah. So actually, it's the simple thing of treating everyone the same doesn't give you the equal outcomes, actually.
And if you think, if you take a simple medical analogy, if several ones of us had a burst appendix, we all would agree that we need to take that out, and that treatment would be pretty much the same because it'd be surgery. But I think that's where things then become different again, because somebody might have left it too long and somebody might have gotten there a little bit earlier. There could even be reasons why that is. Some people will be cooperating better with the recovery period and get out of bed quickly and do everything their medical team asks them to do, others won't. And that's again, some of the treatment was the same, but all the other things around it, that goes back to the context. And that's where the difference comes in. And that might be one of the ways to diffuse the argument. It might be a silly example, but I think, you know, we're not the same, even if you take the same knife and do the same surgery, even there is a subtle difference, because my appendix is different from your appendix.
And can that be the same, can that be a similar concept with mental illness, for example, in mental health space, where you've got the treatment can be the same, but then the context is different? Yeah.
Well, I think in some ways with mental health, there's actually an advantage in looking at from Aboriginal, you know, like I talked about, if it is conceived as social and emotional well-being, it's a much broader and more inclusive concept than mental illness. I always feel a little bit uncomfortable with a lot of the awareness-raising campaigns, and good luck to Beyond Blue and all of them, but they always seem to be around, it's an illness, help's available, get help, and that's it. And there's not much, they have started, I think the campaign that Beyond Blue ran around discrimination against gay and lesbian people in the community, and the fact that discrimination severely impacts on people's mental health was a really good example of taking a little bit broader and not just saying you've got depression, you're more likely to get depression if you're gay, but get help and make sure you get it from somebody nice. You know, that's like that. It's not as simple as that. You know, the same as the hidden discriminator. Did anybody see that, or the ads? I think that was also Beyond Blue, wasn't it? That brought out those fabulous, I think, video clips about, you know, getting on a tram next to an Aboriginal person and then going, your discriminator tells you, oh, don't sit there, it probably smells, or something like that. You know, those are very powerful things about what influences mental health that are much broader than go and get treated. You know, one of the very early, interestingly, one of the first things that triggered the setting up the RAP, or the setting up the formation of the Indigenous psychologists, was a project. I was reminded of it, Greg, when you were speaking. It was called the Indigenous Help Seeking Project. This is back in 2007, just around almost identical to the time of the intervention and a couple of other things, and a little bit before the election of Kevin Rudd. The APS was approached because there was a bit of that end of year, financial year money available from Canberra, and said somebody in Canberra decided that needed to get more Aboriginal people seeking help for mental health problems. So you do a project that tells how to get people seeking help. And I thought, why have you come to the APS? We don't know anything, you know, about this. Is not something we have experience in. We know about mental health, but we don't know much about working with Aboriginal communities. Why did it land on my desk? Don't ask. Fortunately, we managed to, somebody came up with the idea of getting a reference group of as many Aboriginal psychologists as we could find. And that group came together, it was March 2008. They were actually more interested in getting together because it's the first time they ever had, and they formed the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association and took off like a rocket. The project about help seeking, kind of, I was sitting at the back going, hello, we still have to do this project. But one of the things principles that came out of that was really interesting was, what's the point of getting people to seek help if there's no services available in their community? Or if the services that are there are crap and actually kill people, which is the case in terms of actually admissions to, mental health services in psychiatric hospitals. They actually kill a lot of people, but they kill Aboriginal people faster. It's a very high death rate, so they're toxic. So no services available, or bad services if they are. A help-seeking project is not the answer. And how come you don't know that people already haven't sought help? So they turned it around to look at what services were available and what would be there and how do people know where to go, and came up with, we've got a website now which actually maps where all the Aboriginal community controlled health services are, where the stolen generation services are, where the family violence ones, where a whole lot of different services are, so that people would actually say, no, actually there are some really good services that already exist. It's not about help seeking, it's about culturally safe services that people would actually want to use. So that's a really good example, I think, of the sort of thing you're asking for, but it's an interesting history that we've never really written up, but it'd be worth telling the story. Yeah.
Brilliant. Any more questions?
Just with the closure of Health Workforce Australia, do you see any challenges with progressing the governance side of
I think some of Health Workforce Australia has actually been integrated in the Department of Health, but things have become very quiet. I think what you'll notice is that there are a number of things that were happening that have become quite quiet since we had the change of government. My hunch is, but that's my speculation, that a lot of it has to do with our government really trying to look for budget savings, and yeah, some of these things are easy to save budget on. I don't know where some of these initiatives are going. Some of them I think were very worthwhile, and some of them, yeah, we probably could be saying goodbye to. I mean, if you generally speak about elsewhere. I think on, my recommendation would be that we can't always rely on the government. I mean, on some level, I've said earlier, we need to try to continue to influencing policy. And I think that's really, really critical, because otherwise, as a practitioner, you can get really frustrated and burn out if you're trying to change something that really needs to be changed at that higher level. And so I think when there isn't that much in government, think about, is there something that you can do in your practice? And it may not be earth-shaking, but even if people know that your practice is safe, seeing you is an okay place, that they'll not have to justify themselves. That may not seem much, but I think sometimes we need to go for little steps. And at the same time, we shouldn't lose sight of there definitely policy changes that are needed. And yeah, and the APS does lobby on that level, and that's why we do also projects like these, which do attract quite a bit of attention, and where we get very senior people from across the country to inform us, and we then disseminate so that we do get the attention. But I think it's where you're at in your personal stage in life, and folks like me and Heather and Greg, we try to do some of the policy work, and some of you who are still more on that, what in the past we called journey person kind of part of your professional journey, you might do it in a different way. But sometimes if it gets frustrating, recognize we might need to go up to the policy level again.
But there's lots of good resources available now, and there's local Aboriginal health organisations that you can work with. Yeah, and you know, there's a reflection tool on there. There's teaching and learning stuff around.
Just conscious of time, so we'll take maybe one more.
This is more of a comment probably than a question per se, just in line with the policy kind of stuff. And I'll be delighted if I've missed something new and people want to correct me, but I believe that justice targets still haven't been added to the Close the Gap initiative, despite the 13 times greater risk of Indigenous people ending up in incarceration. So yeah, I just wanted to say that there is the Justice Program that ANTAR is currently heading up, and so given this is a forensic practitioner kind of seminar, I thought it'd be worth mentioning that if you are interested in those justice targets and including those targets within the Closing the Gap, there is a petition to sign and more information online through ANTAR.
That's really good point. Yeah, thank you.
And it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, your clients will have their own solutions, you know, and the local Aboriginal communities you're going to come into contact with, hopefully, they will know what needs to be done. The solution's already there. Your role as a clinician or an advocate is not to be the expert, but to be the facilitator, to work with communities to bring up those solutions and help link them up with the right services and help, you know, assist along the way.
All right, terrific. Okay, thanks a lot everyone for your attendance today. And on behalf of the CFBS and the Swinburne School of Health Sciences, I'd love to thank the panel for their insight and for taking the time out to be with us today. So much appreciated, and thanks to Andrew Peters as well.
This has been a Swinburne production.